She spent her life taking care of others. And the man who was supposed to love her and protect her used that kindness against her. That's who Emily was. That's who he killed.
I've sentenced murderers, rapists for unspeakable things done to children, but I've rarely seen something as calculated and cold-blooded as what you did to Emily Caldwell.
The wedding photos were still on the mantelpiece when Detective Sarah Martinez knocked on Margaret Foster's door that cold February morning in Austin, Texas. In those photos, a beautiful young woman in white smiled next to a handsome man in a tuxedo, her blonde hair cascading over her shoulders, his arm around her waist, both of them looking like they had their whole lives ahead of them. That was 14 months ago. Now that young woman was dead, and the detective was about to tell her mother something that would shatter what was left of her world. Not just that her daughter was gone, but who took her, and why, and how long it had been planned. Margaret Foster was 68 years old and had buried her husband 3 years earlier. Lung cancer took Robert in 6 months, leaving Margaret alone in the 4-bedroom house in West Austin where they'd raised their only child, Emily. After Robert died, Emily became Margaret's whole world. They talked every day, sometimes twice a day. They had lunch together every Wednesday at the cafe on South Congress. They went to church together on Sundays at First Baptist, sitting in the same pew the Foster family had occupied for 30 years. Emily was all Margaret had left, and she told her daughter that constantly, maybe too much, maybe in a way that put pressure on a young woman trying to build her own life. When Emily met Brandon Caldwell at a hospital fundraiser in downtown Austin, Margaret had been happy for her. Emily was 26, working as a pediatric nurse at Dell Children's Medical Center, living in a small apartment near campus. She'd dated before but never seriously, always saying she was too busy with work, too focused on her career, too wrapped up in taking care of her aging parents. But Brandon seemed different. He was 32, an investment analyst with a firm in the domain, driving a BMW, wearing expensive suits, everything about him polished and professional and successful. Have you ever met someone who seemed perfect? Too perfect? Comment below if you've ever had that feeling about someone and ignored it. Brandon swept Emily off her feet in a way Margaret had never seen. Within 3 months, he proposed with a 2-carat diamond ring at the top of Mount Bunnell, the same place where Robert had proposed to Margaret 45 years earlier. Brandon couldn't have known that detail, Emily must have told him. Margaret remembered thinking at the time that it was romantic, that Brandon was the kind of man who listened, who paid attention to details, who wanted to honor family traditions. The wedding was small but elegant, held at Barton Springs in September when the Texas heat was finally breaking and the live oaks were starting to think about fall. 75 people attended. Brandon's family came from Houston. His mother Patricia, a real estate agent, his father Thomas, a retired oil executive, his younger sister Claire, a graduate student at Rice. They were polished people, country club people, the kind of family that made Margaret feel slightly self-conscious about her teacher's pension and her husband's life insurance payout that was enough to keep the house but not much more. Emily glowed that day. She wore her grandmother's pearls, the ones Margaret's mother had worn at her own wedding in 1948, and she carried white roses mixed with bluebonnets, Texas through and through. Brandon looked at her like she was the only person in the world, and when he said his vows, his voice cracked with emotion, and Margaret saw tears in his eyes and she thought, this man really loves my daughter. This man will take care of her. This man will be the family she needs now that Robert is gone. They honeymooned in Italy for 2 weeks. Emily sent photos from Rome, from Florence, from the Amalfi Coast, pictures of her and Brandon in front of the Colosseum, sharing gelato in Positano, toasting with wine in a Tuscan vineyard. She looked happy. No, more than happy. She looked radiant, alive, like a woman who'd found exactly what she was looking for. When they came back, they moved into a new construction townhouse in Mueller, one of those modern places with exposed brick and industrial lighting and a rooftop deck with views of downtown. Emily decorated it herself, spending weekends at antique shops on South First, sending Margaret photos of furniture she was considering, asking her mother's opinion on paint colors and curtain fabrics. Margaret helped her hang pictures, arrange furniture, plant herbs in the small backyard garden. It felt like playing house, like when Emily was 6 and would arrange her dolls in elaborate domestic scenes. For the first few months of the marriage, everything seemed perfect. Emily and Brandon hosted Thanksgiving at their new place, fitting 14 people around a dining table meant for 8, everyone laughing and passing dishes and being careful not to knock over wine glasses. Brandon carved the turkey with the kind of confidence that came naturally to him, telling jokes, making sure everyone had enough to eat, playing the role of host like he'd been born to it. His parents were there, and they talked about oil prices and real estate markets and things that went over Margaret's head, but they were kind to her, included her in conversations, asked about her late husband and seemed genuinely interested when she talked about Robert's 30 years as an accountant for the state. Emily pulled Margaret aside that night while they were washing dishes, while the men watched football in the living room and the sound of their voices mixed with the television. Emily was drying a serving platter and she said, "Mom, I'm so happy. Brandon is everything I ever wanted. I know you were worried when we got engaged so fast, but I was right about him. He's perfect." Margaret remembered exactly how the light hit Emily's face in that moment, the kitchen pendant lamp casting a warm glow on her daughter's blonde hair, the diamond on her finger catching the light as she moved the dish towel in circles over the ceramic. She looked like she'd won the lottery. Like she couldn't believe her good fortune. Like she knew she was lucky and was grateful for it. That was 3 months before Emily died. Tell me in the comments. Do you remember the last time you saw someone you loved and thought everything was fine? That moment you replay over and over after learning the truth? The change started slowly, so slowly that Margaret almost missed it. The weekly Wednesday lunches became every other week, then monthly. Emily would cancel last minute. Brandon had surprised her with a weekend trip, or they had dinner plans with his colleagues, or she wasn't feeling well and needed to rest. When they did meet, Emily seemed distracted, checking her phone constantly, apologizing but doing it anyway, saying Brandon liked to know where she was, that he worried about her, that he was protective because he loved her so much. The Sunday church services stopped entirely. Emily said she and Brandon had started going to a church closer to their neighborhood, a contemporary service with a band instead of an organ, more their speed, more their generation. Margaret felt the small sting of rejection but told herself it was natural, that married couples needed their own traditions, their own life separate from parents. The daily phone calls became every few days, then weekly, then sporadic. When Margaret called Emily at work, the nurses would say Emily was with a patient, Emily was in a meeting, Emily would call back. But the return calls came less and less frequently, and when they did, they were short, Emily sounding rushed, saying she had to go, saying she'd call soon, saying she loved her mom but really had to run. Margaret told herself this was normal. This was what happened when children got married and started their own lives. She'd done the same thing to her own mother 45 years ago, pulled away a little, created space for her marriage, put Robert first the way wives were supposed to. It hurt, but it was natural, and she needed to accept it and give Emily room to build her own family. But then there were other things. Small things that accumulated into a pattern Margaret couldn't quite name but definitely felt. Emily stopped posting on Facebook. She'd been an active user, sharing photos of her life, posting about her patients without using names, celebrating small victories at work, marking milestones and special occasions. But after the wedding, her posts became less frequent, then stopped entirely. Her profile picture was still from the wedding, her and Brandon in their wedding clothes, but no new content appeared. Margaret would check every day, scrolling through her feed, looking for any sign that her daughter was still out there, still living her life, still wanting to share it with the world. When Margaret asked about it, Emily laughed it off. "Brandon thinks social media is a waste of time," she said. "He showed me all these articles about privacy and data mining and how everything we post is being tracked and sold. It's kind of nice to be off the grid, you know? To just live life without documenting everything." Emily stopped seeing her friends. The women she'd been close to since high school, the nurses she worked with, the book club she'd been in for 3 years, all of it gradually fell away. When Margaret asked about Sarah, Emily's best friend since middle school, Emily said they'd grown apart, that Sarah was single and going out to bars all the time, that their lives were just in different places now. When Margaret asked about the book club, Emily said the books they were choosing didn't interest her anymore, that she'd rather spend her free time with Brandon. Emily changed her appearance. She'd always worn her hair long, past her shoulders, the same way she'd worn it since she was a teenager. But 6 months into the marriage, she cut it short, a severe bob that ended at her jawline. When Margaret expressed surprise, Emily said Brandon thought it looked more sophisticated, more professional, more appropriate for someone in her late 20s. The blonde color darkened too, shifted from the natural light blonde she'd been born with to a darker shade that looked almost brown in certain lights. "Brandon prefers brunettes," Emily said with a small laugh, like it was cute that she was changing her hair color for her husband. She started wearing different clothes. Emily had always dressed casually, jeans and t-shirts on weekends, scrubs at work, sundresses to church. But she started showing up to their increasingly rare lunches in clothes that didn't look like her. Tailored pants, blazers, high heels, clothes that looked expensive and uncomfortable and like they belonged to someone else. "Brandon thinks I should dress more professionally," Emily said when Margaret commented. He says first impressions matter even on your day off. He picks out outfits for me sometimes. It's sweet. He has better taste than I do anyway. Margaret pushed down the growing unease. She told herself she was being overprotective, that she needed to let her daughter be an adult, that Emily was happy and that was all that mattered. When she mentioned her concerns to her sister Linda over the phone, Linda lived in Dallas and called every Sunday. Linda told her she was being paranoid. That's what happens when kids get married, Linda said. They change. They adapt to their spouse. It's called compromise. Robert probably changed you too when you got married, and your mother probably worried about it just like you're worrying about Emily. But it wasn't just compromise. Margaret knew what compromise looked like. She and Robert had compromised for 42 years, on where to live, how to spend money, what to name their daughter, whether to get a dog, a million small decisions that required both people to bend a little. But Robert had never asked her to stop seeing her friends. He'd never dictated what she wore or how she styled her hair. He'd never monitored her phone or controlled her schedule or isolated her from everyone she'd known before they met. What Margaret was seeing wasn't compromise. It was erasure. Like Emily was being slowly deleted and replaced with someone else, someone who looked like her daughter but wasn't quite her daughter anymore. Comment if you've ever watched someone you love disappear into a relationship. Tell me if you saw the warning signs and didn't know what to do. The last time Margaret saw Emily alive was on a Saturday in January. Emily had finally agreed to lunch, just the two of them at the cafe they used to go to every week. Margaret arrived first, got their usual table by the window, ordered coffee and waited, watching the door, her heart jumping every time it opened, and it wasn't Emily. When Emily finally walked in 20 minutes late, Margaret barely recognized her. Her daughter had lost weight, maybe 15 pounds, maybe more. Her face was drawn, her cheekbones too sharp, her collarbones prominent under her sweater. The short brown hair was pulled back with a clip, severe and unflattering. She wore sunglasses even though it was overcast outside, and when she took them off, Margaret saw the dark circles under her eyes, the exhaustion written across her features. "Baby, are you okay?" Margaret asked, standing up to hug her daughter, feeling how thin Emily had gotten, how fragile her bones felt under the sweater. "I'm fine, Mom," Emily said, but her voice was tired, and she sat down heavily, like even the act of walking from her car to the cafe had drained her. "Just busy at work. We've been short-staffed and I've been pulling extra shifts." They ordered salads. Emily picked at hers, moving lettuce around her plate but barely eating. Margaret tried to make conversation, asking about work, about the townhouse, about Brandon's job, about their plans for the weekend. Emily answered in short sentences, distracted, checking her phone every few minutes, her leg bouncing under the table with nervous energy. "Are you sure you're okay?" Margaret finally asked, reaching across the table to take her daughter's hand. "Emily, talk to me. What's going on?" For just a moment, Emily's composure cracked. Her eyes filled with tears, and her mouth opened like she was about to say something important, something true, something that had been building for months. Margaret leaned forward, waiting, her heart pounding, knowing that whatever Emily was about to say would be significant. But then Emily's phone rang. The ringtone was loud in the quiet cafe, and Emily jumped, pulled her hand away from Margaret's, grabbed the phone like it was on fire. Brandon's name was on the screen. Emily answered immediately. "Hey," she said, and her voice changed completely. The exhaustion disappeared, replaced by something bright and false. "No, I'm still at lunch with Mom. Yeah, just finishing up." "Okay. Yeah. I'll head there now. Love you too." She hung up and looked at Margaret with an apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I have to go. Brandon needs me to pick something up for him before the store closes." "I'm sorry, Mom. I'll call you later, okay?" "Emily, wait," Margaret said, but her daughter was already standing, already pulling on her jacket, already backing toward the door. Whatever she'd been about to say was gone, locked back behind that forced smile and those tired eyes. "I love you, sweetie," Margaret called out as Emily pushed through the cafe door. "Love you too, Mom," Emily said over her shoulder, and then she was gone, climbing into her car. Not the little Honda she'd driven for years, but a newer Lexus that Brandon had bought for her, saying her old car wasn't safe enough, and driving away without looking back. Margaret sat at that table for another hour, her salad untouched, her coffee cold, staring at the empty chair across from her and knowing, absolutely knowing, that something was terribly wrong. But what could she do? Emily was an adult. Emily was married. Emily had chosen this life, and Margaret had no right to interfere. That's what she told herself. That's what she kept repeating like a mantra as she drove home through the gray Austin afternoon. That was 14 days before Emily died. Tell me in the comments if you've ever known something was wrong but talked yourself out of acting on it. Tell me if you've ever had that moment of knowing you should have done more. Emily didn't call later that week like she'd promised. Margaret tried calling her, but the calls went to voicemail. She texted, simple things like thinking of you, hope you're well, and let's do lunch again soon, but the responses were brief. Busy. Talk soon. Love you. Nothing with substance. Nothing that felt like her daughter. On a Tuesday night, Margaret drove past Emily and Brandon's townhouse, just to see if the lights were on, just to know they were home and okay. It was 8 o'clock and both cars were in the driveway, Emily's Lexus and Brandon's BMW. Lights were on in the upstairs windows. Margaret sat in her car across the street for 15 minutes, feeling ridiculous and intrusive and desperate, before finally driving home without knocking on the door. The next day she called Emily's work. She told herself she was just checking in, just making sure Emily was okay, just being a concerned mother. The nurse who answered said Emily had called in sick that day. When Margaret asked if Emily had been sick recently, the nurse hesitated before saying that Emily had missed several shifts over the past month, that they were worried about her, that she seemed off lately but wouldn't talk about what was wrong. Margaret's hands were shaking when she hung up the phone. She called Emily's cell immediately. Voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. She texted, "The hospital said you're sick. Do you need anything? Can I bring you soup?" No response. She called Brandon's cell, a number she'd only used once before, when she needed to coordinate something for the wedding. He answered on the third ring, his voice smooth and professional, like he was taking a business call. "Brandon, it's Margaret, Emily's mother. I'm trying to reach Emily. Is she okay? The hospital said she's sick." There was a pause, just long enough to make Margaret's stomach drop. Then Brandon's voice, concerned and warm. "She's okay, Margaret. Just a bad flu. She's sleeping right now. You know how she is when she doesn't feel well? She doesn't want anyone to see her like that, even you. I'm taking good care of her. I'll have her call you when she's feeling better. Can I talk to her?" Margaret asked. "Just for a minute?" Another pause. "She's really out of it. The doctor gave her something strong to help her sleep. I don't want to wake her up. But I promise I'll have her call you tomorrow, okay?" "What doctor?" Margaret asked. "Did you take her to a doctor?" "Just a minute clinic," Brandon said smoothly. "Nothing serious. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't strep or anything like that. Listen, Margaret, I have to go. I need to check on her. But don't worry. She's in good hands." He hung up before Margaret could ask anything else. She stood in her kitchen with the phone in her hand, her heart racing, every instinct screaming that something was wrong, but what could she do? Drive over there and demand to see her daughter? Call the police and say what exactly? That her son-in-law said Emily had the flu and Margaret didn't believe him? She didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her, thinking about all the small signs she'd ignored, all the changes she'd dismissed as normal newlywed adjustment, all the times Emily had seemed like she wanted to say something but didn't. The next morning, Margaret called Emily's cell at 7 a.m. Voicemail. She called every hour after that. Voicemail, voicemail, voicemail. She texted, "Please call me. I'm worried." No response. She called Brandon's cell. It went straight to voicemail like he'd turned it off. At 2 in the afternoon, she got in her car and drove to the townhouse. Both cars were gone from the driveway. She knocked on the door anyway, rang the doorbell, called out Emily's name. Nothing. The neighbors probably thought she was crazy. She didn't care. She was back in her car, trying to decide what to do next, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it immediately, desperately hoping it was Emily calling from a different phone. But it wasn't Emily. It was Detective Sarah Martinez from the Austin Police Department. "Is this Margaret Foster?" the detective asked. "Yes," Margaret said, her mouth suddenly dry. What's wrong?" "Ma'am, I need you to come down to the station. It's about your daughter, Emily Caldwell." "Is she okay?" Margaret asked, but she already knew the answer. She could hear it in the detective's careful tone, in the way she'd said Emily's name, past tense somehow final. "Ma'am, I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you come down to the station? Or I can come to you if that's easier. Just tell me," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Please just tell me if my daughter is okay." The detective was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Foster. Your daughter was found deceased this morning. I need you to come down so we can talk about what happened." The world stopped. The sound cut out. Margaret was suddenly underwater, everything moving slowly, everything muffled, everything distant and unreal. Her daughter was deceased. Emily was deceased. That word, clinical and cold and final. Deceased. Not sick. Not hurt. Not missing. Deceased. Margaret heard herself ask. Where did you find her? In her home, the detective said gently. Mrs. Foster, I know this is devastating, but I really need you to come down here so we can talk. There's a lot we need to discuss. Do you have someone who can drive you? I don't think you should be driving right now. Oh, Margaret asked. How did she die? Another pause. We're still investigating. But Mrs. Foster, I need to ask you, when was the last time you spoke to your daughter? Saturday, Margaret said. 2 weeks ago. We had lunch. She wasn't herself. I've been trying to call her. Her husband said she was sick. Where is he? Where's Brandon? That's part of what we need to talk about, Detective Martinez said. Please come down to the station. I'm going to send a patrol car to pick you up, okay? You shouldn't be driving. The next hours were a blur. A police officer, Margaret never got the name of, drove her to the station in downtown Austin, speaking in that soft, careful voice people use around the grieving. At the station, Detective Martinez met her, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a firm handshake, leading Margaret to a small room with a table and chairs and a box of tissues that Margaret knew meant she'd need them. Mrs. Foster, Detective Martinez said, sitting across from her, her hands folded on the table, I'm so sorry for your loss. I know this is incredibly difficult, but I need to ask you some questions about Emily and her husband Brandon. Can you do that? Margaret nodded, unable to speak, tissues clutched in her fist. When was the last time you saw Emily? Saturday. 2 weeks ago. What? How did she seem? Margaret's voice broke. Not good. Thin. Tired. Like something was wrong. I asked her about it and she almost told me. I could see it. But then Brandon called and she left and I never saw her again. Tell me about Brandon, the detective said. What kind of relationship did they have? And so Margaret told her everything. The whirlwind romance. The quick engagement. The perfect wedding. And then the slow disappearance. The canceled lunches, the stopped phone calls, the lost friendships, the changed appearance, the weight loss, the exhaustion. Margaret told the detective things she hadn't fully admitted to herself, patterns she'd noticed but dismissed, warning signs she'd seen but ignored. Detective Martinez listened without interrupting, taking notes, her face carefully neutral. When Margaret finished, the detective sat back in her chair and looked at Margaret with an expression that made Margaret's stomach drop. Mrs. Foster, Detective Martinez said carefully, I need to tell you something about how Emily died, and it's going to be very difficult to hear. Margaret braced herself, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Your daughter died from an overdose of prescription medication, the detective said. Specifically, a combination of sleeping pills and anti-anxiety medication. The levels in her system were extremely high, far beyond therapeutic doses. She killed herself? Margaret whispered, the words feeling wrong in her mouth. Emily wouldn't, she was a nurse. She knew about medications. She would never. We don't believe Emily took the medication herself, Detective Martinez said gently. We believe someone gave it to her. Over a period of time. Slowly increasing the doses, making her sick, making her weak, until finally giving her a fatal dose. Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Someone poisoned her? Who would? The detective's next words came like bullets. We believe it was Brandon, her husband. We believe he'd been poisoning her for months, and that he gave her the final fatal dose sometime Tuesday night. The room spun. Margaret grabbed the table to steady herself. No. Brandon loved her. He married her. Why would he? That's what we're trying to piece together, Detective Martinez said. But Mrs. Foster, we need to find Brandon. He's missing. His car is missing. His phone is off. We went to his office this morning, and they said he called in sick yesterday. His parents haven't heard from him. His sister hasn't heard from him. He's vanished. He killed my daughter and ran, Margaret heard herself say, the words coming from somewhere outside her body. He murdered Emily and ran away. We believe so, yes, the detective said. And Mrs. Foster, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to really think about the answer. Did Emily ever tell you she was afraid of Brandon? Did she ever indicate that he was hurting her? Margaret thought back through all those lunches, all those phone calls, all those brief conversations where Emily had seemed like she wanted to say something but didn't. No, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face now. She never said anything. But I should have known. I should have seen it. She was disappearing right in front of me and I didn't do anything. This is not your fault, Detective Martinez said firmly. Abusers are very good at hiding what they're doing. They isolate their victims. They control information. They make it look normal from the outside. You couldn't have known. But I did know, Margaret sobbed. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know it was this. I didn't know he was killing her. Comment below if you're crying. Comment if you've ever lost someone and blamed yourself. Comment if you know what it feels like to replay every missed warning sign. The investigation moved quickly once Emily's body was found. The medical examiner's report confirmed that Emily had died from acute toxicity from a combination of zolpidem and alprazolam, sleeping pills and anti-anxiety medication that Brandon had been prescribed for work stress 6 months earlier. The levels in Emily's system were astronomical, enough to kill her several times over. But it wasn't just the final dose that killed her. The autopsy revealed that Emily had been systematically poisoned for months. Her liver showed signs of chronic medication toxicity. Her kidneys were damaged. Her hair samples showed escalating levels of benzodiazepines going back nearly 6 months, right around the time Emily had started missing work, losing weight, seeming off to everyone who knew her. Brandon had been giving her small doses of his medication, mixing it into her food or drinks, gradually increasing the amount until Emily was constantly foggy, constantly tired, constantly sick but never sick enough to go to a hospital, never sick enough to realize she was being poisoned. It was slow-motion murder, methodical and calculated, the work of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The police searched the townhouse. They found Brandon's prescription bottles in the medicine cabinet. Both pills prescribed 3 months earlier, both nearly empty despite the fact that Brandon had never taken them for himself. They found Emily's journal hidden in a drawer, entries from the past 6 months documenting how sick she'd been feeling, how exhausted, how she couldn't concentrate at work, how she kept having panic attacks and anxiety spirals and couldn't understand why. In one entry from December, Emily had written, "Brandon says I need to see a doctor. He thinks maybe it's depression. Maybe he's right. I can't remember the last time I felt normal. I feel like I'm losing my mind." In another entry from January, just a week before she died, "Something is wrong with me. I can barely get out of bed. Brandon has to help me do everything. He's been so patient, but I can see it's wearing on him. I don't know what's wrong with my body. Why can't I function like a normal person anymore?" She never suspected. Even as he was killing her, Emily thought something was wrong with her. She blamed herself for being tired, for being sick, for not being able to function. Brandon had convinced her that her symptoms were her own failing, her own weakness, something broken inside her that needed to be fixed. That's what abusers do. They make you think you're the problem. They make you doubt your own reality. They make you grateful for the very small mercies they show you even as they destroy you. The police found Emily's laptop, and the search history broke Margaret's heart. Emily had been Googling her symptoms: extreme fatigue, memory problems, anxiety attacks, can't wake up in the morning, sleeping all the time. She'd looked up therapists. She'd looked up vitamin deficiencies. She'd looked up chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and depression and everything except the one thing that never occurred to her, that her husband was poisoning her. There were also deleted text messages, recovered by forensic specialists. Messages between Emily and her friend Sarah, the one she'd stopped seeing. Sarah had written in November, "I'm really worried about you. You're not yourself. Can we please get together? I miss you." Emily had responded, "I know, I'm sorry. I'm just so tired all the time. Brandon says I need to rest more. Rain check." Sarah again in December, "Emily, seriously, what's going on? You don't return my calls, you canceled on the book club again, and the one time I saw you, you looked sick. Are you okay? Is everything okay with Brandon? Emily, everything's fine. Just been under the weather. I'll call you soon, promise." The messages stopped after that. Sarah had tried a few more times, but Emily never responded. Sarah told police later that she'd thought about calling Margaret, about expressing her concerns, but she talked herself out of it, thinking she was overreacting, thinking Emily was just adjusting to married life, thinking it wasn't her place to interfere. Everyone saw something. No one did anything. That's what Margaret learned as the investigation unfolded. Emily's co-workers had noticed she seemed off. Her friends had worried about how much weight she'd lost. The nurses at the hospital had commented on how distracted she seemed, how she'd started making small mistakes. Nothing dangerous but unusual for someone as competent as Emily. Everyone had a piece of the puzzle, but no one put it together until it was too late. Detective Martinez told Margaret all of this gently, carefully, but there was no way to soften the truth. Brandon Caldwell had methodically murdered Emily over the course of 6 months, and he'd done it in a way that made everyone blame Emily for her own deterioration. Tell me in the comments, do you know someone who changed after they got married? Someone who disappeared into a relationship? Did you speak up? If you didn't, do you wish you had? The manhunt for Brandon Caldwell became a media sensation. His photo was all over the news. that handsome face that had looked so trustworthy in his wedding photos, now labeled suspected murderer in bold red text across every news channel. The story had everything the media loved: a beautiful young victim, a seemingly perfect marriage, a shocking murder, a missing suspect. Brandon's parents issued a statement through their lawyer: "We are devastated by Emily's death and cooperating fully with police. We had no knowledge of our son's actions and are as shocked as everyone else by these allegations." They hired their own attorney and refused to speak to the press beyond that initial statement. Brandon's sister Claire told police that she hadn't spoken to her brother in months, that he'd always been intense and controlling, but she never thought he was capable of murder. She said Brandon had always been their parents' favorite, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. She said their father had once told Brandon when Brandon was in high school and got caught cheating on a test, "You're smart enough to never get caught. Next time be smarter." She said she always wondered what that lesson had taught her brother. Brandon's ex-girlfriend from college came forward with a story that made Margaret sick to her stomach. The woman, whose name was kept private by police, said she'd dated Brandon for 2 years at UT Austin, and toward the end of the relationship she'd started having mysterious health problems: nausea, dizziness, memory issues. She'd gone to multiple doctors who couldn't find anything wrong with her. She'd started to think she was going crazy. Then one day she found a bottle of her prescription anti-anxiety medication in Brandon's apartment, even though she'd never brought it there. She confronted him about it and he'd gotten angry, saying she was paranoid, that she was unstable, that she needed help. She broke up with him shortly after, and her symptoms disappeared within weeks. She told police she'd always wondered about it but convinced herself she was being paranoid. Now she knew she wasn't. Brandon had done this before. Emily wasn't his first victim. She was just the first one he'd killed. The investigation revealed that Brandon had a life insurance policy on Emily, taken out 3 months after they got married. $1 million with Brandon as the sole beneficiary. Emily had signed the papers. Margaret saw her daughter's signature, shaky and uncertain, so unlike Emily's usual confident handwriting. Brandon had told Emily it was standard for married couples, that his company offered it as a benefit, that they should both have policies in case anything happened. Emily had trusted him. Why wouldn't she? He was her husband. The police found Brandon's computer, and the search history was chilling. Months before Emily died, Brandon had been researching: how long does it take for sleeping pills to leave system? Can toxicology detect zolpidem after death? Natural causes death certificate. Life insurance payout time frame. How long to contest will? Countries without extradition. He planned this. All of it. The marriage, the poisoning, the murder, the escape. Emily had never been a wife to him. She'd been a mark. A victim. An investment that would pay out $1 million once she was dead. But why Emily? That's what Margaret couldn't understand. Brandon was smart, successful, good-looking. He could have married anyone. Why had he chosen her daughter? Why had he spent a year of his life courting and marrying and then killing a woman who'd never done anything to him? Detective Martinez had a theory, one that made Margaret feel like she was going to vomit. Brandon was drowning in debt. His expensive lifestyle, the BMW, the townhouse, the designer suits, the luxury honeymoon, it was all funded by credit cards and loans he couldn't afford. He was making decent money at his firm, but not enough to support the lifestyle he was presenting to the world. He'd maxed out 6 credit cards. He had 2 car loans he was behind on. He owed his parents money he'd never paid back. He was one bad month away from everything falling apart. He needed money. Fast. A lot of it. And he was smart enough to know that murdering someone for insurance money is the oldest trick in the book, the first thing police suspect. So he needed to be careful. Patient. Methodical. He needed to make it look natural or like suicide at worst. He needed time to establish himself as the grieving husband, the devoted spouse who'd taken care of his sick wife until the very end. And he needed the right victim. Someone vulnerable. Someone without a lot of family. Someone whose death wouldn't raise too many questions. Emily fit the profile perfectly. She was an only child. Her father was dead. Her mother was aging and alone. She was kind and trusting and didn't have a cynical bone in her body. She was a nurse, so if she started having health problems, it would make sense that she'd try to manage them herself rather than making a big deal. She was the perfect target. Brandon had researched her before they ever met. The hospital fundraiser where they'd met by chance? Brandon had bought a ticket specifically to go to that event, specifically to meet Emily Foster, whose name he'd gotten from somewhere, maybe from a wealthy patient at the hospital, maybe from social media, maybe from asking around about single nurses who came from middle-class families with some money but not too much family complexity. He'd researched her enough to know about Mount Bonnell, about her father's death, about her close relationship with her mother. He'd used all of it to manipulate her, to make himself seem perfect for her, to sweep her off her feet before she had time to think clearly. The whirlwind romance wasn't romance. It was strategy. Get her to fall in love quickly, before she had time to do her own research on him. Get her to marry him quickly, before his financial situation imploded. Get the insurance policy in place quickly. Then start the slow process of killing her, making it look like depression or illness or anything except what it actually was: murder. Margaret learned all of this in pieces over weeks and months as the investigation continued. Each new revelation was another knife in her heart. Her daughter hadn't just been murdered. She'd been hunted, selected, groomed, and systematically destroyed by a man who'd seen her as nothing more than a means to $1 million payout. Have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be evil? Comment below if you've ever looked back on a relationship and seen all the red flags you missed. Tell me if you know what it's like to realize someone you loved never existed. Brandon Caldwell stayed missing for 47 days. 47 days of Margaret living in a nightmare, unable to grieve properly because the man who killed her daughter was still out there somewhere, possibly planning his next victim, possibly living on a beach somewhere with fake documents and a new identity, possibly laughing about how he'd gotten away with it. The FBI got involved. Brandon's face was on America's Most Wanted. There were sightings. Someone saw him in Miami, someone else in Seattle, another person in Toronto. None of them panned out. Brandon had vanished like smoke, and with each passing day the chances of catching him got smaller. Margaret spent those 47 days in a fog. She planned Emily's funeral but barely remembered it. Hundreds of people came: Emily's co-workers, her friends, people from church, nurses who'd worked with her, patients' families she'd helped over the years. Everyone talked about what a good person Emily had been, how kind, how caring, how dedicated to helping others. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. Her daughter had spent her life taking care of people, and the person she trusted most had used that trust to kill her. Margaret couldn't cry at the funeral. She was beyond tears. She stood at the front of the church in the black dress she'd worn to Robert's funeral 3 years earlier, shaking hands and accepting condolences and nodding when people said inadequate things like, "She's in a better place now," and "at least she's not suffering anymore." What they didn't understand was that Emily had been suffering for months, while everyone watched and did nothing. After the funeral, Margaret went home to her empty house and sat in Emily's old bedroom, the room that was still decorated the way it had been when Emily went to college. Posters on the walls, trophies on the shelves, photos of high school friends tacked to a bulletin board. Margaret sat on the bed that Emily had slept in for 18 years and tried to understand how her daughter's life had gone from this innocent room to a townhouse where she was slowly poisoned to death by the man she'd married. The rage came later. The bone-deep fury that consumed Margaret like fire. Rage at Brandon for what he'd done. Rage at herself for not protecting Emily. Rage at a world where a man could systematically murder his wife and everyone just watched it happen and did nothing. Rage at the system that valued life insurance payouts over human lives, that made marriage a legal contract that gave husbands access to their wives' money and bodies and lives in ways that were still, even in 2024, frighteningly medieval. Margaret started researching domestic violence, intimate partner violence, coercive control. She learned terms she'd never heard before: financial abuse, reproductive coercion, isolation tactics, gaslighting. She read statistics that made her sick. 1 in 3 women will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women between ages 15 and 44. Women are more likely to be killed by their intimate partners than by anyone else. She read stories from survivors, women who'd escaped men like Brandon, who'd seen the warning signs and gotten out before it was too late. She read stories from women who didn't escape, whose obituary said, "died unexpectedly," or "died after a long illness," when the truth was they'd been murdered by men they loved, men they trusted, men who were supposed to protect them. Emily should have been a survivor story. She should have been someone who saw the warning signs and got out. She should have been someone who called her mother and said, "Mom, I think something's wrong with Brandon," and Margaret would have come and gotten her immediately, would have helped her file for divorce, would have protected her the way mothers are supposed to protect their daughters. But Emily never got that chance. Brandon had moved too fast, isolated her too completely, poisoned her too thoroughly. By the time Emily might have realized something was wrong, she was too sick to think clearly, too exhausted to fight back, too dependent on the man who was killing her to even imagine he was the source of her suffering. Tell me if you're angry. Tell me if this story is making you want to scream. Tell me if you've ever felt helpless rage at a system that fails women over and over and over again. Because that's where Margaret was. Drowning in rage and grief and guilt and a desperate need for justice. On day 47, Detective Martinez called Margaret at 6 in the morning. Margaret had been awake anyway. She didn't sleep much anymore, just lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations with Emily, looking for the moment she should have intervened, the thing she should have said or done that would have saved her daughter's life. "Mrs. Foster," the detective said, and Margaret could hear something in her voice. Relief. Satisfaction. "We found him." "Where?" Margaret asked, sitting up in bed, her heart suddenly pounding. "Laredo. He was trying to cross into Mexico with a fake passport. Border Patrol flagged him. He's in custody. He's being transported back to Austin." "Is he talking?" Margaret asked. "Is he saying anything?" "No," Detective Martinez said. "He lawyered up immediately. Hasn't said a word except to demand his attorney. But Mrs. Foster, we have him. He's not getting away. There's enough evidence to put him away for life, even without a confession." Margaret should have felt relief. She should have felt vindication. But all she felt was empty. Brandon being in custody didn't bring Emily back. It didn't undo 6 months of systematic poisoning. It didn't erase the terror Emily must have felt in her final moments, if she'd been conscious enough to feel terror, if she'd realized in those last seconds what was happening to her and who was doing it. "When's the trial?" Margaret asked. "It'll be months before it gets to trial," the detective said. "There's going to be pre-trial hearings, motions, jury selection. These things take time. But he's not getting bail. He's staying locked up until this is resolved. I'll keep you updated on everything." Margaret hung up the phone and sat on the edge of her bed in the pre-dawn darkness. The man who'd murdered her daughter was in custody. That should have meant something. That should have felt like something. But it didn't. It just felt like another day in a life that no longer made any sense, another morning waking up in a world where Emily was gone and nothing would ever be right again. Comment below if you've ever waited for justice. Tell me if justice, when it came, felt like enough. Tell me if anything ever felt like enough after losing someone you loved. Brandon Caldwell's trial began 9 months after Emily's death, on a cold November morning in Austin. Margaret sat in the front row of the courtroom, right behind the prosecutor's table, where she could see Brandon's face, where he would have to see her every single day and know that Emily's mother was watching him, judging him, waiting for him to pay for what he'd done. Brandon looked different than he had at the wedding. Thinner. Paler. His hair was longer, messier. He wore an orange jail jumpsuit instead of expensive suits. His hands were cuffed in front of him. But his expression was the same, calm, composed, almost bored, like this was all a minor inconvenience rather than a murder trial. He never looked at Margaret. Not once. He kept his eyes forward or down, like she didn't exist, like Emily had never existed. The prosecutor was a woman named Linda Chen, a veteran of the district attorney's office who'd handled dozens of murder cases. She was small and fierce, with black hair pulled into a tight bun and a voice that carried authority. She told Margaret before the trial started, "I'm going to make sure he pays for what he did to Emily. I promise you that." The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of testimony and evidence and crime scene photos and medical examiner reports and expert witnesses explaining how zolpidem and alprazolam work in the human body, how they accumulate, how they kill. 3 weeks of Margaret sitting in that courtroom listening to strangers talk about her daughter's body, her daughter's organs, her daughter's last moments, using clinical language that stripped away Emily's humanity and reduced her to evidence. Linda Chen methodically built the case. She walked the jury through Brandon's financial problems, the credit card debt, the car loans, the money he owed to his parents, the lifestyle he couldn't afford. She showed them the life insurance policy, Emily's signature shaky on the page. She showed them Brandon's computer search history, all those questions about medication toxicity and death certificates and extradition. She brought in the medical examiner who explained that the levels of drugs in Emily's system could not possibly have been self-administered, that Emily would have been unconscious after the first few pills, that someone had to have given them to her, had to have held her down or forced them into her or dissolved them in liquid and made her drink. She brought in Emily's co-workers who testified about how Emily had changed over the months before her death. The weight loss, the exhaustion, the memory problems, the way she'd seemed to fade away right in front of them. She brought in Sarah, Emily's best friend, who cried on the stand talking about how she'd tried to reach Emily, how Emily had pulled away, how Sarah had known something was wrong but didn't push hard enough, didn't insist, didn't save her friend. She brought in Brandon's ex-girlfriend from college, who testified about her own mysterious illness, the medication she'd found in Brandon's apartment, the way her symptoms disappeared after they broke up. The jury leaned forward during that testimony. You could see it clicking into place for them. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a pattern. This was who Brandon Caldwell was. And then Linda Chin brought in Margaret, put her on the witness stand and asked her to talk about her daughter, about the weeks before Emily died, about that last lunch where Emily had seemed like she wanted to say something but didn't. Margaret told the jury about watching her daughter disappear, about knowing something was wrong but not knowing what, about the guilt that consumed her every single day because she hadn't done more, hadn't saved Emily, hadn't protected her from the monster she'd married. When Linda Chin asked Margaret to describe Emily, Margaret looked right at the jury and said, "My daughter was the kindest person I've ever known. She became a nurse because she wanted to help people. She spent her life taking care of others. And the man who was supposed to love her and protect her used that kindness against her. He saw a good person and decided to destroy her for money. That's who Emily was. That's who he killed." Several jurors were crying by the time Margaret stepped down from the stand. Brandon still didn't look at her. Didn't show any emotion. Sat there like a statue while people testified about the woman he'd murdered, the life he'd destroyed, the evil he'd done. The defense attorney, a slick lawyer named Richard Morrison who specialized in defending wealthy clients accused of terrible crimes, tried to argue reasonable doubt. He suggested that Emily might have been depressed, might have taken the pills herself, might have had a secret drug problem that no one knew about. He tried to suggest that the ex-girlfriend was lying, that she was a disgruntled former partner trying to get revenge. He tried to paint Brandon as a grieving husband who'd been wrongly accused, a victim of circumstantial evidence and a rush to judgment. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw through it. After deliberating for only 8 hours over 2 days, they came back with a verdict: guilty. First-degree murder. Premeditated. With special circumstances of poison, which in Texas carried the possibility of the death penalty. Margaret was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She watched Brandon's face when the foreman said guilty, looking for some reaction, some sign of humanity, some indication that he understood what he'd done. But there was nothing. He just stood there, expressionless, as if the verdict was about someone else, as if Emily's murder was something that had happened to someone else and he was just a spectator. Comment if you've ever seen someone show no remorse. Tell me if you've ever looked at another human being and seen nothing looking back. Tell me if evil is real. The sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks later. In Texas, murder with special circumstances could carry either life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. The prosecutor had chosen to seek death, arguing that Brandon's crime was particularly heinous, that he'd systematically tortured Emily for 6 months, that he'd done this before to another woman, that he was a danger to any woman who ever trusted him. Margaret had mixed feelings about the death penalty. She and Robert had discussed it once, years ago, in the abstract way people discuss moral issues when they don't think it will ever affect them personally. Robert had been against it. Margaret had been unsure. Now, sitting in that courtroom, knowing that the state might kill the man who'd killed her daughter, Margaret still didn't know what she wanted. Part of her wanted him dead. Wanted him to feel fear the way Emily must have felt fear. Wanted him to suffer the way Emily had suffered. Wanted him erased from the world so she'd never have to think about him breathing the same air, eating food, seeing sunlight, experiencing any of the small pleasures of being alive that Emily would never experience again. But another part of her, a quieter part, a part that sounded like the woman she'd been before Emily died, thought that death was too easy. That Brandon should spend the next 50 years in a cell thinking about what he'd done, living with the consequences, being forced to exist in a cage the way he'd caged Emily in that townhouse, slowly poisoning her, slowly killing her, slowly stealing every good thing about her life. The sentencing hearing lasted a full day. The prosecution brought in victim impact statements. Margaret's statement, which she read with a shaking voice, looking at Brandon and telling him exactly what he'd taken from her, exactly what Emily's absence meant, exactly how many days she'd woken up wishing she was dead too because a world without Emily was unbearable. Sarah spoke. Emily's co-workers spoke. People from church spoke. Everyone testified to what a loss Emily's death was, not just to Margaret but to the world. The defense brought in Brandon's family, his mother sobbing, saying her son had had a difficult childhood, that his father had been hard on him, that he'd always struggled with feeling inadequate. His sister Claire, more honest, saying she didn't know the person her brother had become, that she couldn't defend what he'd done. His father didn't testify. Thomas Caldwell sat in the back of the courtroom looking angry and embarrassed, the way men of his generation look when their families fail to live up to expectations. And then the judge, a stern woman named Rebecca Washington who'd been on the bench for 20 years and had a reputation for being tough but fair, asked if Brandon wanted to make a statement before sentencing. This was the moment Margaret had been waiting for. 9 months since Emily died, 9 months of silence from the man who'd killed her, 9 months of wondering if he felt anything at all about what he'd done. Margaret leaned forward in her seat, her hands gripping the bench in front of her. Brandon stood. His lawyer whispered something to him, probably telling him to stick to the script they'd prepared. Brandon looked at the judge. Not at Margaret. Not at the gallery where Emily's friends and co-workers sat. At the judge and only the judge. I loved my wife, Brandon said, his voice flat, emotionless. Emily was everything to me. I would never have hurt her. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. The evidence against me is circumstantial and has been misinterpreted. I'm innocent. And I will continue to fight these false charges and prove my innocence. That was it. No apology. No remorse. No acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just a bland denial, delivered with all the emotion of someone reading a grocery list. He sat back down and Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, some last small hope that maybe he was human after all, maybe he felt bad even if he'd never admit guilt, maybe somewhere deep down he knew what he'd done was wrong. But there was nothing. No humanity. No remorse. No soul. Just a man who'd calculated that denying everything was his best strategy, who'd decided that he could lie his way out of this the way he'd probably lied his way out of everything his entire life. Judge Washington looked at Brandon for a long moment. Then she looked at her notes. Then she looked back up, and when she spoke, her voice was hard. Mr. Caldwell, I've been a judge for 20 years. I've seen a lot of terrible things in this courtroom. I've sentenced murderers and rapists and people who've done unspeakable things to children. But I have rarely seen something as calculated and cold-blooded as what you did to Emily Caldwell. You didn't kill your wife in a moment of passion. You didn't make a mistake. You planned her murder for months. You researched it. You selected her as a target. You manipulated her into marrying you. You isolated her from her friends and family. You made her dependent on you. And then you slowly poisoned her, day after day, week after week, watching her get sicker and weaker, watching her suffer, and you did nothing except give her more poison. You stole 6 months of her life. You stole her ability to say goodbye to her mother. You stole her future. You stole all the patients she would have helped, all the lives she would have touched, all the good she would have done in this world. You stole all of it for $1 million that you thought you could collect and use to pay off your credit card debt. The judge paused, letting that sink in. $1 million. That's what Emily's life was worth to you. That's what you sold her for. That's the price you put on a human being. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The jury found you guilty, Judge Washington continued. And I agree with their verdict. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Your guilt is not in question. The only question before this court is what punishment you deserve. She looked down at her papers again, and Margaret held her breath. The state has asked for the death penalty, Judge Washington said. And while I believe your crime warrants the ultimate punishment, I'm not going to give it to you. Because death is too easy. Death is an escape. Death means you don't have to live with what you've done. Instead, I'm sentencing you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your natural life in a cell. You will never be free. You will never see the sun except through bars. You will never have another moment of peace or comfort or joy. You will live every day knowing what you did and knowing that this is your punishment. And when you die, decades from now, I hope, after a long and miserable life, you will die in that cell, alone, unmourned, and unforgiven. She banged her gavel. Brandon Caldwell, you are remanded to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to serve your sentence. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court certainly won't. The courtroom erupted. People were crying, applauding, shouting. Margaret sat frozen in her seat, watching as guards led Brandon away in handcuffs, watching as he walked out of the courtroom without looking back, without showing any emotion, without giving her or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing him broken. And Margaret realized something in that moment. Brandon Caldwell would never give her closure. He would never apologize. He would never explain. He would spend the rest of his life in prison maintaining his innocence, telling anyone who would listen that he'd been wrongly convicted, that he'd loved Emily, that this was all a terrible mistake. Justice had been served. The system had worked. The man who'd murdered her daughter would spend the rest of his life in prison. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like Emily was still dead and Margaret was still alone, and nothing, not guilty verdicts, not life sentences, not courtroom speeches about punishment and mercy, nothing would ever make that right. Tell me in the comments, is justice enough? When someone you love is gone, does it matter if the person who killed them goes to prison? Does it help? Does anything help? The years after Brandon's conviction were strange ones for Margaret Foster. She was 69 years old when the trial ended, 69 years old and alone in a house that felt too big, in a life that felt too small, with nothing but memories of a daughter who'd been taken too soon and rage at a man who'd taken her. Margaret became obsessed with the case in a way that probably wasn't healthy but was the only way she knew how to cope. She read everything written about the trial, every newspaper article, every blog post, every true crime podcast episode. She watched the 48-hour special and the Dateline episode and the Investigation Discovery documentary. She saw her own face on television, saw herself on the witness stand, saw herself saying, "My daughter was the kindest person I've ever known," over and over in different contexts. Her grief repackaged as entertainment for people who would watch and then move on to the next case, the next tragedy, the next family's worst nightmare. She joined online groups for families of murder victims. She found communities of people who understood what she was going through, people who'd lost children and siblings and parents to violence, people who knew what it felt like to have your life divided into before and after. She made friends with women whose daughters had been killed by intimate partners, women who understood the specific horror of knowing your child had been murdered by someone they trusted, someone they'd loved. Through these groups, Margaret learned statistics she wished she didn't know. She learned that intimate partner violence kills 3 women a day in America. She learned that most women are killed by current or former partners, not by strangers. She learned that the most dangerous time for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she tries to leave. She learned that coercive control, the kind of slow, systematic isolation and manipulation Brandon had done to Emily, was only criminalized in a handful of states, and that most abusers never faced charges until they escalated to physical violence or murder. She learned about red flags she'd missed or dismissed. The whirlwind romance, the quick engagement, the isolation from friends and family, the control over appearance and schedule, the monitoring of phone and social media. She learned that what she'd interpreted as Brandon being attentive and devoted had actually been Brandon being controlling and possessive. She learned that he just wants to spend all his time with me, and he likes to know where I am because he worries, and he has strong opinions about how I should dress, were not signs of love but signs of danger. She learned all of this too late to help Emily. But maybe not too late to help someone else. Margaret started speaking at domestic violence awareness events. She told Emily's story to audiences of social workers and counselors and healthcare providers, people who were on the front lines of identifying and helping abuse victims. She talked about the warning signs she'd missed, the conversations she'd failed to have, the moments when she'd known something was wrong but had talked herself out of interfering. She talked about what she wished she'd done differently, how she wished she'd trusted her instincts, how she wished she'd pulled Emily aside and said, "Is everything okay with Brandon? Are you safe? Do you need help?" The first time Margaret gave one of these talks, she broke down crying halfway through and couldn't finish. The second time she made it to the end but barely. By the 10th time she could tell Emily's story without falling apart, could walk audiences through the timeline of Emily's murder with clinical precision, could make clear the patterns of coercive control and the ways that abusers isolate and manipulate their victims. After her talks, women would come up to her. Sometimes young women Emily's age, sometimes women Margaret's age, sometimes teenagers who looked terrified. They would tell Margaret their own stories. They would say, "My boyfriend does that too," or, "My husband monitors my phone like that," or, "I thought I was crazy for thinking something was wrong." And Margaret would give them resources, hotline numbers, shelter information, safety planning guides. She would tell them, "Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And it's not your fault. None of this is your fault." Some women thanked her and walked away and she never knew what happened to them. She hoped they got out, got safe, got help. Others she'd hear from months or years later. Emails or letters saying, "I heard you speak, and it gave me the courage to leave," or "Your daughter's story saved my life." Those messages were bittersweet. Margaret was glad to help, glad that Emily's death could mean something, could save other women. But it also meant that there were so many women in danger, so many Emilys out there right now being slowly isolated and controlled and hurt by men who were supposed to love them. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever heard someone's story and realized you were in danger too? Have you ever been the person who shared your story and helped someone else? Tell me about it. On the 5th anniversary of Emily's death, Margaret visited her daughter's grave. It was a cold February morning, the same kind of gray winter day when Detective Martinez had knocked on her door to tell her Emily was gone. Margaret brought white roses and bluebonnets, the same flowers Emily had carried at her wedding, back when Margaret had thought Brandon Caldwell was the best thing that had ever happened to her daughter. Margaret knelt in the grass beside Emily's headstone. The inscription said, "Emily Marie Foster Caldwell. Beloved daughter, caring nurse, taken too soon." They debated whether to include Caldwell, or just use Foster. Emily had legally changed her name when she got married, had been excited about it, had practiced writing Emily Caldwell over and over like a teenager with a crush. In the end, Margaret had decided to include it. Emily had been Emily Caldwell when she died. Erasing that wouldn't change what Brandon had done. "I'm sorry," Margaret said to the headstone, her hand pressed flat against the cold marble. "I'm so sorry I didn't save you. I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening. I'm sorry I didn't trust my gut and drag you out of that house whether you wanted to leave or not. I'm sorry I was worried about being an overbearing mother instead of being the mother you needed." The words were the same ones she'd said 5 years ago, and 5 years before that she'd probably still be saying them when she died. The guilt didn't go away. It didn't fade with time. It just became something she carried, a weight she'd bear for the rest of her life. "But I want you to know," Margaret continued, talking to her dead daughter the way she talked to her hundreds of times since Emily died, "I'm trying to make your death matter. I'm telling your story. I'm helping other women. I'm doing what I can to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to someone else." She told Emily about the women she'd helped, the speaking events she'd done, the domestic violence organizations she'd volunteered with. She told her about the legislation she was pushing for in Texas, a law that would make coercive control a crime, that would give law enforcement tools to intervene before abuse escalated to murder. They were calling it Emily's Law. It had been introduced to the state legislature. It probably wouldn't pass this session. These things took time, required advocacy, needed public pressure, but maybe next session. Maybe the session after that. Margaret would keep fighting until it passed, and then she'd fight to get similar laws passed in other states. She'd make Emily's Law spread across the country, make coercive control a recognized crime everywhere, make it harder for men like Brandon to slowly destroy women like Emily. "Your life mattered," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "You mattered. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure people know that. Making sure your death saves lives. Making sure you're remembered as more than just another victim, another statistic, another woman killed by her husband." Margaret sat by the grave for another hour, just being with her daughter, feeling close to her in the only way she could anymore. When she finally stood to leave, her knees aching from kneeling on the ground, she made Emily a promise. "I won't stop. I'll never stop. I'll fight for you until the day I die." Comment below if you've ever made a promise to someone you lost. Tell me if keeping that promise is what keeps you going. Margaret Foster lived to be 84 years old. She spent the last 16 years of her life as an advocate for domestic violence victims, speaking at hundreds of events, helping countless women recognize abuse and find resources to escape. Emily's Law eventually passed in Texas in 2032, 8 years after Emily's death, making coercive control a crime and giving victims legal recourse before abuse escalated to physical violence. Margaret was in the state capitol when the governor signed it into law, and she wept as she watched her daughter's name become part of Texas legal code. Similar laws spread to other states over the following years, each one inspired in part by Emily's story, by Margaret's advocacy, by the public awareness campaign that grew from one mother's grief. By the time Margaret died in 2040, coercive control laws existed in 32 states, and federal legislation was pending in Congress. Brandon Caldwell remained in prison throughout these years. He filed appeals, all of which were denied. He maintained his innocence, writing letters to journalists and appearing in documentaries, always claiming he'd been wrongly convicted, always insisting he'd loved Emily and would never have hurt her. No one believed him. The evidence was too overwhelming, his guilt too clear. He would spend the rest of his life in a cell, exactly as Judge Washington had sentenced him. Margaret never visited him in prison. She never wrote to him. She never sought any contact with the man who'd killed her daughter. Some people asked why, asked if she wanted to confront him, to look him in the eye and tell him what he'd taken from her, to try to get some kind of explanation or apology. But Margaret knew Brandon Caldwell had nothing to give her. He was empty inside, devoid of empathy or remorse or humanity. Confronting him would be like confronting a wall, pointless and frustrating and ultimately just more pain for herself. Instead, she focused her energy on helping the living. On women who were in danger now. On changing laws that could save lives. On making sure Emily's death meant something, counted for something, became part of a movement toward justice and safety and a world where women didn't have to die at the hands of men they trusted. When Margaret Foster died in her sleep, her obituary didn't just list her as Emily's mother. It listed her accomplishments, the legislation she'd championed, the organizations she'd founded, the thousands of women whose lives she'd touched through her advocacy. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, many of them women who credited Margaret with saving their lives, who'd heard her speak and recognized their own situations in Emily's story and had found the courage to leave dangerous relationships. They buried Margaret next to Emily and Robert in the small cemetery on the outskirts of Austin. 3 members of the Foster family reunited at last. At the funeral, women who'd never met Emily Foster Caldwell stood up and spoke about how Emily's story had changed their lives, how Emily's death had sparked a movement that saved them, how Emily, who'd spent her life taking care of others as a pediatric nurse, was still taking care of people even after death, still saving lives, still making a difference. That was Margaret's legacy. Not the grief and guilt and rage, though those were real and valid and part of her story, but also the transformation of that grief into purpose, that rage into action, that guilt into a mission to make sure no other mother had to watch her daughter slowly disappear into a dangerous relationship while everyone stood by and did nothing. Tell me in the comments, what's your takeaway from this story? What are you going to remember? What are you going to do differently? This is the story of how a mother discovered her son-in-law had killed her daughter 1 year into marriage. But it's also the story of how that mother took her unbearable grief and transformed it into a movement. It's the story of how one woman's death became thousands of women's salvation. It's the story of how paying attention to warning signs, trusting your instincts, and refusing to be silent about abuse can literally save lives. Emily Foster Caldwell was 26 years old when she was murdered by her husband Brandon Caldwell. She was a pediatric nurse who dedicated her life to caring for children. She was kind and trusting and saw the best in people. She married a man she thought loved her, and he systematically poisoned her for 6 months until he finally gave her a fatal dose of medications that stopped her heart. Her death devastated her mother. But her mother took that devastation and turned it into advocacy. Margaret Foster spent 16 years making sure Emily's name meant something, making sure coercive control was recognized as the dangerous crime it is, making sure women had legal recourse and social support to escape abusive relationships before those relationships turned deadly. Emily's law now exists in 32 states and counting. It gives women the right to press charges against partners who isolate them, control them, monitor them, financially abuse them, all the things Brandon did to Emily that weren't technically illegal at the time but absolutely should have been. It gives law enforcement the tools to intervene before abuse escalates to murder. It saves lives every single day. If you're reading this and you recognize yourself in Emily's story, if your partner isolates you from friends and family, monitors your phone or your spending, controls what you wear or how you style your hair, makes you account for all your time, gets angry when you want independence, makes you feel like you're going crazy or that everything is your fault, please hear this. That's not love. That's abuse. And it will escalate. It always escalates. You are not crazy. You are not overreacting. Your instincts that something is wrong are correct. And there is help. There are resources. There are people who will believe you and support you and help you get safe. Again, this is Dark Echoes Crime, where all your true crimes are found. Do well to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time.